Welcome, Age of Vintage Society. Bela Lugosi was an ethnic Hungarian actor from Romania, well known for playing Count Dracula in the Broadway play and subsequent film version. In the last years of his career he featured in several of Ed Wood's low-budget films. Though he achieved a great deal of fame, Bela Lugosi suffered a lifetime of being typecast as a horror villain or mad scientist, a problem that was only exacerbated by a serious morphine addiction later in his career. How Bela Lugosi destroyed himself entirely. Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. Moviedom's archetypical Dracula, Bela Lugosi, will always be remembered as the father of horror movies. But for all his memorable, scary work on the screen, he had many demons in real life. He sabotaged his own auditions, he destroyed his marriages, he wasted money faster than he could make it, and he spent the last 20 years of his life in the thrall of morphine addiction. Despite being one of the biggest stars of the early talkie era, Lugosi seemed to be a man driven to self-destruction. His portrayal of the blood-sucking Count Dracula in 1931's Dracula is one of the most important moments in cinematic history. It not only breathed life into an industry of horror movies that continues today, but it imbued the character with a mystique and even sex appeal that still endures. It is a long way from Transylvania to Hollywood. Bela Lugosi began as an uneducated extra and anonymous Hungarian bon vivant, but ended up as a Hollywood legend, writing film history as one of the world's great myth-makers and horror movie stars. He played an immortal role, gave it his own face, demeanour and Hungarian identity, a character so petrified in permanence that he never succeeded in stepping out of Dracula's coffin. He was a famous monster, a creature highly sought after by the industry, running the gamut of evil and psychopathy, and dying on screen in every imaginable way. He was the go-to actor for the personification of the dark genres. It was a pigeonholed character that he eventually considered a prison house, but paradoxically it guaranteed the survival of his worldwide fame among movie lovers. In His Homeland, Lugosi has been largely erased from moviegoer memory, but for the rest of the world he ranks among the most famous Hungarians. Over 5 decades after his death in 1956, people from around the world continue to travel to his native land to look for his roots, and not just film historians, die-hard horror and cult movie aficionados, intrigued by his origins, want to piece together the puzzles of his life. One of the most widespread delusions about Lugosi in Hungary is that he was a second-rate actor only good for roles in B-movies in Hollywood. It is an undeniable fact that few of his films were ever shown to movie and television audiences in Hungary, but this should not overshadow the fact that not only did Lugosi take part in more than 120 films, he took the leading role in the vast majority of them. Even before he left Hungary, he was a favourite screen face of the silent film era. In just 2 years he appeared in no fewer than 12 Hungarian films, each of which shared the same fate as 95% of all films shot between 1901 and 1930. They were either destroyed or vanished without a trace. Unfortunately, Lugosi had more valleys in his career than he did peaks, but he gave the world, and horror fans especially, something special. Those last years were ones of bathos, a screen star whose star had fallen from on high, only to crash and burn in the fires of professional and personal humiliation. Lugosi had indeed known the heights, but for a shorter time than one might imagine. By the end he had come to know the depths more fully. As the saying goes, nothing recedes quite like success. In his case, that mercurial liquid had vanished almost as quickly as it had unexpectedly swamped his life. As in the best horror tales, the cross prevailed, while the vampire perished. Nevertheless, the story you are about to hear is one of the real horrors endured by Lugosi, and more terrifying than any screen role he played. Before he was Bela Lugosi, horror film actor, he was Bela Ferenc Deszko Blasco, born in 1882 in Hungary. Lugosi had his eyes set on the stage since he was a young boy. The youngest of 4 siblings, Lugosi was only 11 or 12 years old when he left behind his stern father and home. Then the Hungarian town of Lugos, now Lugoj in western Transylvania, today part of Romania. At first he worked on odd jobs to support himself, but soon embarked on what would become a remarkable and unprecedented career in acting. He took to the theatre in his home country before becoming a stage actor in Germany and changing his name to Lugos. The theatre crowd were fond of Lugosi without considering him to be a great promise. His handsome looks, well-bred manners, dignified posture and aristocratic composure set him up well for conversation plays and amorous roles. He became tremendously popular with audiences, although critics were lukewarm. Perhaps driven by such doubting voices by a sense of being neglected, or maybe by a realization of the power of the audience, Lugosi turned toward the silver screen. Following World War I, he worked on a merchant marine ship and immigrated to the United States, where he found small roles on stage but had to learn his lines phonetically. As someone who thought and cursed in Hungarian to the end of his life, Lugosi had a limited command of English at the time and a huge accent, but he worked tirelessly on phonetically memorizing his lines. Then at last his roller coaster career, which looked like it was stalling, eventually took off. Aside from his stage work, Lugosi found some success in playing baddies in small films, usually as an evil foreigner thanks to his exotic looks. Most prominently he appeared in The 13th Chair, a film directed by his future Dracula cohort, Todd Browning. In 1929 Lugosi stepped into the cape of his most famous role, Count Dracula. What could be more poignant for an American shaken by the Great Depression than an archetypical story of a blood-sucking aristocrat exercising a reign of terror over the villagers, a story of aggression which more than hinted at repressed sexual desire. Mainstream cinema in those days had no choice but to embrace the demand for a shocking, horrifying brand of entertainment. Universal gave it everything they had, and the masterpiece it produced was crowned by the presence of Lugosi. It seemed Lugosi harboured something of a secret for New World audiences, something alien and mysterious, an air of restlessness and strain, a sense of being continually torn inside. He seemed cold as ice, while at the same time practically bursting and seething with energy. Dracula owes its famous capacity to engender fear not so much to the expert cuts between scenes and to sound effects as to Lugosi's piercing intensity and ability to hold sway on the screen. He shaped his character meticulously, building the role from head to toe, suffusing a tuxedo and gown with believable life. And although he no longer looked as trim and dashing as in his early Playboy days, legend has it that, following the premiere, he received more love letters than Clark Gable did in the wake of Gone with the Wind. But though he pioneered the role of Dracula, cementing in the audience's mind what Stoker's vampire should be, Lugosi didn't make much of a payday off his performance. He was only paid $3,500, $54,672 with inflation, and didn't receive a percentage of the box office or the millions of dollars in merchandise that came along with it. Lugosi attracted many female admirers through the role, including the it girl of 1920s Hollywood, Clara Bow. After the film version, however, he resented how the role led him to being largely typecast for the rest of his career. His strong accent didn't help, and over the years he ended up in more and more B films. Following the surprise success of Dracula, Lugosi received offer after offer to play the heavy in horror films. In what could have been a massive windfall for Lugosi, he was Universal's first choice to play Frankenstein's monster in their adaptation of Mary Shelley's story. Lugosi didn't want to be typecast strictly as a horror actor, and he thought that the makeup would cover his leading man good looks. Lugosi was never great with money. His contract for playing Count Dracula, one of the most important film characters of all time, didn't cover his lavish lifestyle. He lived in a couple of massive homes and couldn't stop buying art and strange pieces that never appreciated in value. By 1937 he was so short on funds that he couldn't afford the hospital bill for his son's birth. Throughout the 30s and 40s, Lugosi took whatever roles were given to him, and he accepted the paltry rates that came along with them. He appeared as Igor in a series of horror films, and even played Frankenstein's monster in Universal's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. By the 50s, Lugosi was stuck working with Ed Wood in cheapo exploitation films. Wood was a huge fan of Lugosi's, but the movies weren't good and they didn't make a lot of money, essentially robbing the actor of the two things he wanted the most: admiration for his acting chops and cash. There's nothing new under the sun, especially not in Hollywood. In 1955, Bela Lugosi was in a sad state. The once handsome Hungarian-born star of Dracula had seen his career degenerate over the previous 2 decades, until at last he was reduced to playing a cruel parody of himself in some of the tackiest B horror films ever made. Along the way he picked up a drug habit. He was perhaps the first Hollywood star to openly admit to his drug addiction. Lugosi had become dependent on drugs after being prescribed opiates for relief of painful sciatica in the late 1940s. As his habit grew, his career slid into Z-list movies, and his dope fiend reputation kept producers from hiring the legendary actor. Living the junkie life in direst poverty, Lugosi was given the chance of a comeback by the infamous Ed Wood, who offered the actor work on Glenn or Glenda and Bride of the Monster. Grateful for the chance to turn his life around, Lugosi made a very important phone call. In late April of 1955, the 72-year-old actor, destitute and recently divorced from his 4th wife, checked himself into the psychopathic ward at Los Angeles General Hospital. A few days later, in a hearing held at the ward, Lugosi pleaded with a judge to commit him to a state hospital. A United Press article from April 23, 1955 describes the scene. Although weighing only 125 pounds and only a shadow of his former self, Lugosi's voice was clear and resonant as he told the court how shooting pains in his legs led him to start taking morphine injections in 1935. Without morphine he couldn't work, Lugosi said. I started using it under a doctor's care, he said. I knew after a time it was getting out of control. 17 years ago, on a trip to England, I heard of methadone, a new drug. I bought a big box of it back home. I guess I brought £1, Lugosi said. Ever since I've used that, or Demerol, I just took the drugs. I didn't eat. I got sicker and sicker. Methadone treatment with its heinous side effects was virtually unknown throughout most of the world until the 1960s, but it had been developed in England during the late 30s, and something was known there of its effect in treating addiction. The judge commended Lugosi for taking action to fight his addiction and committed him to the Metropolitan State Hospital in Norwalk, a suburb of Los Angeles, for a minimum of 3 months and a maximum of 2 years. When Lugosi finally entered a state hospital in 1955, he was broke, gaunt, and a shell of his former self. In interviews, he claimed that his addiction cost him thousands of dollars, and that he spent money on drugs even when he didn't have enough cash to eat. During his time in the hospital, the old man plotted his comeback. As his hope of a genuine comeback crumbled, Lugosi drank heavily. He was released from the state hospital on August 5, 1955. On August 16, 1956, he passed away from a heart attack at the age of 73. Lugosi was buried in a cape that he wore while playing Dracula in the Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. It was to prove a tragic end for an actor synonymous with the supernatural. When it did come, it was to be an exhausted finale to what by then had become a pathetic existence. It was rumoured that he died longing to see a priest. Perhaps not so surprising after all, as according to his latest and final wife, in those last years, he was terrified of dying. Of course he was right to be, for, as with any Catholic, Bela Lugosi knew all too well the reality of what lay beyond. Buried in the cape that had made him famous, he was interred in Holy Cross, Hollywood's Catholic cemetery. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the life and legacy of Bela Lugosi? His roles as a cool, cynical loner combined with a notorious personal life and a sardonic, relaxed style to create a durable screen image as a fatalistic, tough guy.